Jujutsu Kaisen is a relatively new Shonen Jump manga that's been selling very well in Japan ever since it began in 2018. With the anime adaptation in development, it's now finally made its way to the English-speaking market, both digitally and in print. Because it's now part of the weekly Viz Media online magazine, in addition to the first 3 volumes being out, and the series celebrating its second year anniversary with 100 chapters, I thought it'd be a good time to see what all the fuss was about. This video will cover my impressions of the first 3 volumes, and the first 25 chapters of Jin Akutami's successful manga. The series focuses on Yuji Itadori, a first-year high school student with unnatural strength and speed. Shortly after his hospitalized grandfather passes away, a mysterious boy approaches the grieving Yuji in the hospital lobby. Megumi Fushiguro, a student from Tokyo Jujutsu High and a sorcerer fighting against the supernatural. It turns out a mysterious box Yuji gave to his friends in the occult club seals away a cursed human finger. It belonged to the most evil and dangerous sorcerer in all of Japanese history, Ryomen Sukuna, and it contains a fragment of his insane powers. Additionally, his remains still contain traces of his evil wickedness, and curses and cursed spirits find themselves drawn towards strong negative emotions like that. It is the responsibility of Jujutsu sorcerers to destroy these curses, which are, in addition to be drawn to negative emotions, made from them, and they prey on human beings. These curses instinctively seek out Sukarna's powers by eating his remains and anybody who gets in their way. Rushing back to save Yuji's friends after the curses attack them, both Megumi's magic and Yuji's strength are completely overwhelmed by the curses. With lives on the line and his back against the wall, a desperate Ryuji decides the sensible thing to do would be to copy the curses, by eating the thing that they want to eat, swallowing the finger whole and trying to gain its powers so he can fight back. This would normally kill a human being, but instead it causes the spirit of Ryomen Sukuna to incarnate into Yuji's body with 5% of his full strength. Fortunately, Yuji's natural ability allows him to contain and suppress Sukuna until he willingly gives over control to the spirit now living inside him. Unfortunately, this means that the elders of the Jujutsu world have marked Yuji for a swift execution to ensure that Sukuna is never unleashed again. But Megumi's teacher, Gojo Satoru, has different plans. Because Sukarna's remains are completely indestructible, they are a constant risk to human life. But Yuji can eat them, break them down, and safely absorb the pieces into his own body. It's Gojo's idea that he can either kill Yuji right now, or use him to track down the remaining 19 fingers so they can ensure Sukuna dies for good along with him, therefore ending a 1,000-year threat to mankind. Yuji goes along with this because he's living on borrowed time, and decides that the power to contain Sukarna's fragments comes with the responsibility to do so. He feels that he has to clean up this mess as a way of preventing anyone else from being killed over these fingers, and this will let him spend his final days fulfilling his grandfather's wish, that he will help people whenever he can. Not everybody is happy with Gojo's scheme, but the half-cursed Yuji becomes a student at Jujutsu High School, alongside Megumi and the new transfer student from the country, Nobara Kugisaki. Together, they'll learn more about sorcery, battle against curses, save lives, solve murders, and, hopefully, die in the comfort of their friends. A lot of what I just explained isn't that unique or special. With the exception of the execution plot points, the first 3 volumes sound like the typical introduction of a hero into the hidden world of urban fantasy. What makes Jujutsu Kaisen feel different is the overall tone and the scale it works on. The best comparison to a different series is probably the Chapter Black saga of Yu Yu Hakusho, a storyline that swapped out the demons for evil humans with psychic powers and fights set in places like bars and roadsides and hospitals. And Jujutsu Kaisen feels like that as the starting point for an entire series, and seemingly the scale the entire thing is going to work on going forward. Even with characters being able to use their Jujutsu sorceries to warp space to suit their needs, the majority of fights happen in mundane locations, like rooftops, schools, and waterways. But it's more than just a rewind of Chapter Black. The characters aren't a carbon copy of Yusuke's gang, and neither is the tone or the style. Jujutsu Kaisen has a very earthy, understated tone that manages to do a lot more with a lot less. Something I've never seen in a battle series to this level before. I'm going to use an example from the first chapter, which does a very good job of setting up Yuji's normal school life before tearing it down. Yuji has banter with his friends, conflict with the student council president, and constantly butts heads with the school teachers about wasting his talents. You get a sense of what Yuji is leaving behind when he goes away to join the Jujutsu school, even though it's just been a few chapters. But the most important thing, that is heavily implied but never explicitly said, is that Yuji has been building his life around his sick grandfather. Even though he does like the other members of the occult club and enjoys working with them, he really is only there because it's the only club that finishes early enough for him to visit his grandfather in the hospital after school. But when his grandfather gets mad at him for showing up, he tells the stubborn old man that he's only doing it to pass the time because his club finishes early. And when his grandfather does die, Yuji has to tell the nurses. And then the perspective cuts away, and next time we see him, he's filling out paperwork with marks under his eyes, making it very obvious that he has been crying, but that personal moment is left to Yuji, and you have to pick up on it yourself. Which goes through the entire series. Small details come back later on, or things that go unsaid have weight and meaning, partly because the series does something quite rare, which is having unintelligent characters also be inarticulate as well. Again, from the first chapter, when Yuji gets philosophical about death, like any teenager dealing with the death of a relative for the first time, he tries to explain himself, but he just doesn't have the right words. Megumi has to pick up on what he's trying to say and what he's going through. Nobara's motivation in joining the school is that she wants to be a big city gal, instead of living out in the countryside, which isn't as selfish and short-sighted as she makes it sound. She's just not interested in explaining herself or isn't aware of how insanely vain she comes across to people who don't know what she's been through. And can I just say, I like that Nobara is just as stupid as Ryuji and about 4 times more conceited with just a bit more experience in fighting cursed spirits. She's not the sensible one that has to struggle with the boys being idiots or hot-headed. That's Megumi. That's Megumi's job. And I've mentioned Megumi a lot so far, but I've never focused on him, and that reflects how the story treats him as well for a while. For the whole first volume, around 9 or 10 chapters, he's just there. Not offensive or anything, just in the background, not saying or doing anything interesting outside of showing off his powers. He's the stoic pretty boy who doesn't say much, especially compared to the flashier, more bombastic characters around him. He's basically just there for exposition and to show off his magic powers, which allow him to summon animal spirits through shadow puppets. Megumi only really comes to life as a character in the second volume towards the end of the first major story arc. You get a lot of insight into how he sees Jujutsu sorcerers as cogs in the machine, and that his stoicism is mainly because he's constantly thinking about the big picture and morality. And his fixation on the long term and the grand scale means that he shows no pity for people he thinks are bad, but he also keeps himself deliberately calm so he can do everything in his power to protect people he sees as good. It doesn't matter if those people agree with his judgments or not, it doesn't matter if anyone else agrees with him. Megumi would rather die than let those types of people down. And he doesn't get angry when people disagree with his philosophy. And he also does recognize that even wicked, terrible people are human beings. Even if he thinks a criminal should be eaten alive by curses and it isn't worth risking anyone's life to help them, he's fully aware that their family are probably innocent people, and those people deserve whatever kindness he can give, because that is ultimately what he is about. He is about kindness and fairness, just through a fairly cynical lens. And frankly, his big moments, his big character scenes are my favourites throughout the entire series so far. Which does also mean my favourite chapters of the entire series involve him getting savagely beaten by other fighters and cursed spirits. Constantly. I hope he gets to win at least one fight in the near future. Which makes this a good time to start talking about the curses, and maybe the artwork. The curses take a while to improve. By Volume 3, they have become appropriately unnerving to look at. A lot of the early curses are not very memorable. The major one in the first chapter looks like a giant tick, which does make sense in the mythology of the series. Curses are born from negative emotion and develop properties and abilities based on that emotion and what that emotion is targeted towards. So people have been getting sick from infections spread by ticks. Their dislike for ticks and being sick because of them has led to a monstrous one being created. It's just not very scary to look at. There's obviously been a lot of thought put into its design and how its body moves, but I don't think that or any of them for the first 2 volumes, outside of maybe the special grade from the Fearsome Womb storyline, are very interesting to look at. And even the Fearsome Womb spirit is just a monstrous humanoid. Designs get better as the series goes along, with the standard monsters being given this misshapen, malformed look that is just uncanny enough to be genuinely creepy. And some of the special grades are just human beings with facial markings. The curses are okay as far as evil spirits go. I'm grateful the series wastes no time bringing in a group of powerful curses that can actually think and talk, so there can be actual villainous characters instead of just mindless monsters. Additionally, there are also some human characters who we aren't meant to like, even if they aren't explicitly evil. There's a girl called Mai from a rival school, and in about 3 pages, the series makes her very easy to hate. She's like a combination of a battle royale killer and a High School Musical villain. She just has this instant air of being a stuck-up cheerleader and a murderer with the smile of both of them. It's very difficult to explain, and I feel like it might just be because she's wearing a sleeveless dress. I don't know. The thinking, feeling curses show up early on and outline what the series is going to be about and what the overall story is going to be for a little while. It gives the series a nice bit of structure. Additionally, we see that some of them have obtained Sukana's fingers, but haven't consumed them yet. So we have set up a reason for Yuji to fight these people at some point. In terms of villainous motivations, these cursed spirits believe that humans hide their real feelings. Those hidden feelings become cursed spirits. Therefore, cursed spirits are the true faces of humanity. Therefore, the human beings are fake because what makes them human are the surface-level emotions they use to cover up their real feelings. Therefore, the fakes should be destroyed and ruled over by the genuine article. Therefore, curses should take over as the true face of humanity. Which is a perfectly fine motivation as far as early villains go. It's simple, easy to understand, and you can see how they come to the conclusion in the scene they present it. It's also about as complicated as a creature that is incapable of having a wide range of emotions could possibly come up with. When a creature is born of anger and made of anger, the only real emotions it can express are filtered through anger and rage, so it would make sense for it to have this negative view on humanity. And there are at least a few mystery men in the shadows who transparently do not believe this and do not care. They are clearly working towards their own goals, using these cursed spirits as a stepping stone or a temporary partner in crime. So there is always room to improve and expand on later on. One of these people is actually a human being called Geto. Gito. Do you pronounce that name Geto or Gito or Gato? Gito, Geto, or Gato? I'm going to pronounce it Gito for the rest of the video, but I'm going to assume I'm wrong in the long term. Gito works with the cursed spirits, but very obviously does not take them seriously, and seems to hate it whenever one of them acts like their partnership makes them equals. His general attitude so far is mild amusement that the curses think this is going to work, and being vaguely helpful, while also having his own goals, and shrugging off anything he says or does that gets them into trouble. He also looks like a Shaman King villain. Everyone else has this rough sketch, geometrically shaped style, and in he comes looking like he was beaten by Yoa Sakura 10 years ago, and he's back for revenge on humanity. On the subject of artwork, the look of the series is something I really go back and forth on. Sometimes it's a style I really like, and other times it's just a look I have to roll with. There's a lot of white on the pages. Like Bleach, it's very focused on the contrast between black and white without much grayscale, except for some clothing where it's used to highlight the black. And the line art is interesting and I guess rough. with characters' outlines changing a lot, with different thickness, so it has a loose look to it, and sometimes it doesn't even look inked, and he might have decided that the pencils were good enough. I'm not sure. I never think that itself is a problem. It can add some real energy and aggression to an action series in ways hyper-detailed, refined art can struggle with. And I feel like the author is experimenting a lot, and it's not always clear what continues on from what. Panels overlap with other panels. Limbs sometimes stretch across them, drawing away from the choreography in that panel to what's going on in the one overlapping it. Some characters are facing in one direction, only for the perspective to completely shift and ruin the sense of space in the scene. This gets much better as it goes along, but a lot of the hits in the first volume do not have any impact. Part of it might be intentional because Jujutsu sorcerers can rip through lesser curses with ease, and higher rank curses can do the same to sorcerers, but overall it feels like the action is just happening. Not too bad that it ruins it, but not too good that it's a selling point. Some moments that are meant to be understated simply feel underwhelming, but it does also lead to one of my favourite moments of the series so far. So it works, as well as also not working. Things really start to improve in the second volume, where the big action scenes are fun, tense, exciting, and so on. The third volume keeps the action strong, while also focusing in on body horror, and making you uncomfortable without any blood or guts. Some of it relies on building a normal atmosphere and then contrasting it with something terrible, or sometimes something horrible happens in a completely normal urban environment. The human skull is not meant to bend and swell up. I wasn't expecting to see that in the series, but it's very effective when it does. That does lead to the series brushing up against a problem a lot of urban fantasy series have. How do they manage to cover up all these brutal supernatural murders and keep the public from learning the truth about the supernatural? But getting back to the art, overall, it fits the series' tone and enforces it. As extreme as the violence can be, people burning, being crushed, twisted, limbs being hacked off, etc., it's a very discreet-looking series. The flashiest weapon we've seen so far is a completely normal hammer Nobara has engraved a heart into, and someone else uses a wrapped-up sword. Nobody's outfit is ridiculously complicated or flashy, and there aren't many loud overreactions like there are in other series. It's got a very grounded feel that, again, the artwork reflects. With the exception of some of the monsters and the person wearing Dr. Eggman glasses, the designs are interesting for how simple they are. If you put these characters in another series, they would look as if they don't have a speck of style to share amongst them. But in this series, it actually mostly works. If, for example, you put the Jujutsu characters in My Hero Academia, they'd be the blandest, most boring people in that entire series. But here it's fine, and sometimes simplicity is best, and Jujutsu Kaisen is doing it well. But unlike the character designs, there is undeniably complexity to the story. There's a lot of setup here, a lot of subplots, a few different factions at play, a few mysteries at play, and some quite elaborate rules about the sorcery. The series slowly introduces things and explains them as it goes along. The names of some characters and some abilities are mentioned at least 6 chapters before they make an appearance and are fully explained. And some things have either not been explained yet or are so abstract the real definition, the real practical definition, is coming sooner or later. There's a lot of rules being brought up, including characters being able to create domains where they control the environment, and those all seem to have their own unique rules and properties and appearances as well. One of the established traits of cursed energy, the fuel for the cursed techniques, which are basically just the magic of the series, is that most of the abilities are based on what you were born with. So some characters have a ton of magical power and dozens of ways of using it. Some have mediocre power, but have a few abilities with a lot of variety. Some have power, but no technique. Some have great abilities, but just use martial arts, and some are totally powerless. And most characters have their own unique powers or unique versions of powers with their own strengths and limits. Although I do have to wonder why some of the rules are as complex as they sound. For example, there's a sorcerer called Kento Namine. And he's great. Loved his fighting style and his view on life. He's part of that exhausted salaryman fighter archetype that's becoming more common nowadays. His technique is that he can mentally draw lines over a target and then cut it at either the 30% mark or the 70% mark to deal crippling damage. It's something that lets him do serious damage to opponents who are much stronger than him, or things that he could not normally cut through. The question I have is, why is his ability not just defined as creating weak points on a target? What do the additional rules actually do? What do they add to his character? What do they add to fights? Because it seems like he has so much control over where the lines appear and what size they are, he can basically just choose any part of his opponent to make into a weakness. So, will these rules and complications actually make a difference in the future, or are they just overly complicated for the sake of being overly complicated? But I won't deny that when the powers are insane and the fights are abstract, they can be really exciting. The biggest example is the power of Gojo, which means I can finally talk about him and his role in the story. Great. You can tell that this series really wants you to like Gojo Satoru. He's the coolest and the strongest and the most handsome, and he's just the best at everything. And I liked Gojo. I have a soft spot for the 28-year-old character wearing a blindfold. It's a very specific soft spot. But his matter-of-fact confidence is quite endearing, best summarized by his opinion on the danger of Ryomen Sukuna, who is legendarily powerful, and his major fights read so far like watching someone pull the wings off a fly and then pinning them to a wall. I know this is a manga, and therefore everybody is superhuman unless said otherwise. I don't know how people survive punches from Sukuna. The series really makes it sound like he should be splattering human beings across the walls whenever they fight him. But Gojo's general reaction to his strength and the legendary power he possesses is, nah, I'd beat him if I wanted to. But no one believes me. So we're just going to do this other thing about executions now. But don't worry about it. If anything gets out of hand, I'll step in. Strongest guy to ever live. Name's Gojo. May have heard of me. May not. I'm also your school teacher now. He is canonically known as the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer in the world, and he's so far beyond everyone that Gito suggests that the Curse's plan only works if Gojo is restrained or too busy to deal with them, because it is a plot point that none of the villains can actually defeat him. And the brief demonstration of his power makes this really convincing. His unique ability is that he can basically take the imaginary concept of infinity and make it into physical reality. So he can create space where there was no space. So he can make a 3-step gap take forever because he's just adding space to it as you're passing through it. But because he's creating it so quickly, it feels like your body isn't moving forward at all, like you've hit an invisible wall. I barely understand it, and the other characters don't understand it either, and it's not even the only thing he's doing while he's beating them senseless. He's fun, but what makes Gojo interesting is his serious side and how it reflects on the setting. The world of Jujutsu is not a gentle place. Yuji's main fear is dying alone and forgotten. The heroic plan is that his friends and teacher will put him down like an animal at his most useful. The cursed spirits are born from unending negativity from humans. There is no hint that they can actually be permanently dealt with, even if the individual ones are killed off. The curse techniques our heroes fight with are fueled by the sorcerers channeling their anger and resentment as a weapon, using the curse's own energy against them. The students are outright told the best outcome for them is to one day be killed in a way that leaves a twisted mess of a body behind. Because for a lot of Jujutsu sorcerers, their fates are far worse. Dying by your own ideals so you won't curse the person you promised to fight for is treated as the most important thing going forward. And to be able to fight the monsters in the shadows of human society, it's not enough to be brave. You have to fight like a madman. And human beings have souls. But it doesn't matter, because it's just another part of existence. The value of human life is a volume-long mystery. Even people who don't have to deal with the supernatural have problems. There's a fairly lengthy mini-arc about a boy, Junpei, whose apathy and resentment towards high school, the bullying, and wider Japanese culture leave him open to manipulation by these more intelligent curses. And can I just say, this series does the misanthropic everyman who is involved but barely connected to the main characters is done better in this series than in a lot of seinen manga actually end up doing it. And even beyond that, the clans and the elders of the Jujutsu organizations are stuck in their ways and are willing to endanger and kill innocent people to ensure their stranglehold over the organizations, which is something that Gojo resents and wants to change, and they know it, which is why they're perfectly willing to put his students in danger to keep him isolated. But even with all of his great power, Gojo knows he can't just destroy the system. Gojo could kill every single corrupt member of the Jujutsu world. No one would be able to stop him. He's that strong. But if he did that, there would be chaos, and there wouldn't be enough people to fight back against the curses. And nobody would ever trust him ever again. And because Gojo is still human and limited by not being able to be in two places at once, he needs other people to support him. That's why he wants to reform the situation from the ground up by being a teacher. This way he can raise the next generation to buck tradition and the corrupt ways of thinking he believes are stopping the Jujutsu sorcerers from being the most effective. Now that I'm thinking about it, it's the Superman conflict. You have this character who is completely invincible, who runs into problems his powers can't solve. Not only that, everybody he holds dear is a potential target, and because he can't actually change the world through force, he has to lead by example and teach people to be better. And we see that that is working through Megami. They make a big deal out of how instead of using talismans to summon his creatures, the traditional method, Megami has stripped the technique down to being more pragmatic. So instead of letting the animals do the fighting for him and having to worry about items, Megami uses shadow puppets and hand signs to summon monsters from his own shadow alongside his own martial arts skills. This way he can fight any curse at any range, and his enemies have to keep track of the animals, his punches, where his hands are, how he's moving his fingers, and what possible animal he could summon next in combination to everything else he's done so far. And it's not all just doom and gloom. The world is more complicated than all of its evils. Yuji might be in a bad situation, but he has a positive influence over the people around him. Megami and Naone fight like madmen, but even they hold their own heroic ideals, even if people disagree with them. Even people who want to follow the rules say they don't like how things are run, so Gojo's reform plan is still getting support. The political backstabbing at the top isn't the only thing that matters. And even people's assumptions about the world are proven wrong. Like with Nobara. When she shows up, there's a serious concern that she might not be able to fight the curses from Tokyo. Crime in the cities and the sheer amount of people having negative thoughts in a densely populated area means that more powerful curses will be created in Tokyo than in the countryside. But Nobara has a brief scene about how her village is a cruel place to outsiders and deeply resentful towards city folk, which gives the impression that Nobara has seen more ugliness and human cruelty in that small town than she has ever seen from uptown folk, with the implication being that her town put pressure on her to conform to her standards, and it seems like Nobara is ultimately so rude and temperamental because she just wants to be herself instead of being limited or controlled, which also might be why she's so calm in the face of death. She's happy with who she is and the choices she's made, so dying like herself seems like a nice thing to happen. None of that sounds particularly positive, but she seems to think it is, and the idea that people aren't inherently better or worse because of where they're from or where they live is also a somewhat positive outlook on the world. And if you've been listening to me talk and think that I've been ignoring Nobara for too long, that's basically how the first few arcs treat her. Jujutsu Kaisen is spinning a lot of plates with all of its plot lines, ideas, characters, teams, factions, and terminology. And I won't say it's always been graceful, and I think that might be its biggest weakness so far. While the setup is good, especially if you're paying attention to the minor details that come up later, there hasn't been much payoff yet. A lot of the ideas about how the magic works have been interesting, but not fully demonstrated in a normal fight. Yuji has superhuman strength and speed without explanation, although possibly something to do with his father. There's something going on with Megumi's powers, but we don't know what. There are binding vows that cannot be broken, and we don't really know what that means. Sukana has a plan in mind, and we don't know what. There's a lot of behind-the-scenes political backstabbing in motion, but we haven't seen any of the dominoes fall. There's a goodwill event between the two schools coming up. Gito's motivations have not been explained at all. There are all sorts of characters running around on their own who are either setting up their own plot lines or coming into the main plot, which is also sort of split in two by the time Volume 3 has started. And the issue with this is that it comes across as unfocused and disjointed at times. Nobara gets a very good introduction at the start of the series, where 2 or 3 chapters focus quite heavily on her, and then she very quickly starts to fade into the background for Volume 2 and Volume 3 outside of the comedy scenes. Volume 3 starts as if it's going to start jumping between 2 different storylines consistently, so that the main plot is moving forward for both sets of characters, but instead we move forward with one of them while seeing the majority of the main cast not really doing much when we do see them. And this also means that I sometimes can't tell if the series is deliberately not telling me something, or if it just didn't succeed in getting something across that was very important. There's a point made about a certain character, I won't spoil who it is, having a scar on their face. And I cannot tell you if they had that since the beginning, if they've gotten it over the course of the arc, if it's relevant to their particular grudge, if it's something to do with the supernatural. And this disjointed feeling continues into the chapters themselves. Where they can have a cliffhanger, the next chapter will open with a dynamic action shot, and then flash back to show how we got there from 1 page ago. And this can happen with new characters being introduced, who we've never met before, palling around with the main characters, before then cutting back to a brief flashback to show who they are, what they're about, and why they're working together. The big example is in the first and second volumes, where there is a brutal deathmatch at the end of a chapter. Opening scene of the next chapter, a character who should be in that fight is doing things and thinking about things that were said off screen, then cutting back to see how that brutal deathmatch led to this by directly continuing on from the cliffhanger. Just seems like going in a chronological order would have made things easier to follow and retained the excitement the previous chapter built up. But even with all this in mind, it never feels aimless. It always reads like Jin Akutami knows what the plan is, so that you should have faith in his abilities to go back to things eventually. Even though the author notes make it sound like he's nervous and constantly worried about something or upsetting anyone, Akutami writes with what feels like very real confidence in what he's doing, what he's set up. I'll use the example of Sukana's plan as an example. Sealed demons having goals and plots of their own isn't new. It's what they do. It's the baseline for every type of plot that features this type of character. What does the monster sealed away inside a human being want? Either control of the body or total freedom. That's what they all want, that's what they always want, and Sukana is no different. He wants Yuji's body for himself and to kill people. It's not especially interesting on its own. The difference here is that Sukana has taken steps towards whatever his actual goal is that seems to run completely counter to his stated interests. He is deliberately hamstringing himself for some reason. He outright says this. His actions will deliberately benefit Yuji at his own expense. And they aren't building up a trusting relationship or anything. Sukana is doing this for a host that hates him and plans on killing him. Every single limit he puts on himself feels like a story element you would only bring in for this type of character if you had a very specific plan in mind. Either a short-term thing for the next few story arcs or a long-term thing for the next dozens of chapters. You would not go to these extremes otherwise. You wouldn't overcomplicate these things otherwise. Akutami could have just let Sukana be a spirit that could take over any time as a source of drama or a way of Yuji beating stronger foes at a higher risk. But Akutami clearly has something else in mind, and he gives a very specific foundation that other writers would choose to leave vague in case their plans change. And the faith in his ideas really shines through. As a story, Jujutsu Kaisen isn't really doing anything that different yet. If you have a history of reading shonen battle manga, especially ones set in the modern day, you can see the things that are pulled from Yu Yu Hakusho and the other big names from the genre. But it's doing it well and with a style and tone that's all of its own. The art does take some getting used to, and you may just have to tolerate it, but the writing is what's pulling it forwards. I do think that it needs to start paying off something in the next few volumes, because it can't keep going with what feels like 5 main plot lines for the next 50 chapters. Something has to be dealt with. Someone has to be permanently defeated, or someone has to make his or her move sooner rather than later. I'm interested in all of these stories, but I really want to know how the writer handles resolving his plot lines. Which puts me in an interesting situation. Because while I'd recommend the series so far, I can either come back in the next few months when the next 3 volumes come out to talk about them, or I can read it digitally in the Viz Media magazine or on Manga Plus to catch up until the latest story arc and then talk about it then in half the time, or I can just talk about everything, including the latest arc when I next come back. If anyone has a preference, please let me know, because I'm incredibly easily swayed and I want to know if anyone would be interested in me talking about this again. So far, first 3 volumes, Jujutsu Kaisen, quite positive. Thank you for watching. Good night.